In this episode, we're going to focus on the documentation that turns incident response from a collection of good intentions into a dependable program that works the same way no matter who is on shift, what day it is, or how stressed everyone feels. New learners often picture incident response as a moment of action, like someone spots a threat and the team jumps in, but organizations do not succeed in those moments unless they prepared for them in calm moments. Program documentation is that preparation, and it matters because incidents are noisy, time-sensitive, and emotionally charged, which is exactly when memory fails and improvisation gets people into trouble. The goal of incident program documentation is to create consistent decisions, consistent roles, and consistent evidence handling so the organization can respond quickly without turning chaos into extra damage. By the end, you should understand what kinds of documents make up a mature incident response, IR, program, and how those documents drive consistent response across cloud services, on-premises systems, and third-party dependencies. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to begin is to understand what an incident response program actually is, because beginners sometimes treat it as a single plan stored in a folder that only gets opened during emergencies. A program is broader than a plan because it includes governance, roles, routines, training expectations, and a method for learning and improvement, not just a list of steps. The documentation is the visible structure of that program, meaning it captures decisions about what counts as an incident, who has authority, what evidence must be preserved, and how the organization communicates. This matters in cloud environments especially because incidents can involve fast-moving changes, shared responsibility with providers, and assets that scale or shift rapidly, which makes improvisation even riskier. Documentation creates a stable foundation even when the technical environment is dynamic, because people can return to shared rules when everything feels uncertain. When the program is documented well, response becomes more consistent, which reduces both impact and confusion across teams that may rarely work together until a crisis forces them into the same room. One of the most important pieces of documentation is the program charter, because the charter explains purpose, scope, and boundaries in a way that prevents assumption-driven conflict. The charter should make it clear what the incident response program covers, such as systems, data, cloud services, third-party dependencies, and business processes, and it should also clarify what is outside scope so the team does not waste time trying to solve problems it cannot control. The charter should define what success means, not in dramatic terms, but in practical outcomes like reducing time to detect, reducing time to contain, and preserving the integrity of investigations and communications. It should also establish the relationship between the incident response program and other operational programs, such as problem management and business continuity, because incidents often blur the line between security and reliability. Beginners often assume everyone agrees on these boundaries automatically, but during a real event, people's assumptions collide, and a clear charter prevents the team from losing time to debates about whether this is an incident, whose job it is, or which process should be followed. A charter is the document that makes those questions answerable quickly. The incident response plan itself is still essential, but the plan must be written as an operating guide rather than as a theoretical description of what incident response means. A plan should define phases of response in a way the organization can follow consistently, such as how to move from initial detection to triage, then to containment, then to recovery, and finally to review and improvement. It should also define the criteria that trigger movement between phases, because uncertainty can cause teams to either jump too quickly into containment without preserving evidence or wait too long for perfect confirmation while damage spreads. In cloud environments, the plan must also account for the fact that containment choices can be fast and powerful, such as restricting access or isolating resources, but those actions can also disrupt services if applied without care. The plan should therefore emphasize disciplined decision points, including how to balance speed and caution, especially when business-critical services are at stake. Beginners should notice that the plan is not meant to be read like a textbook during a crisis. It is meant to be used, which means it must be clear, concise in the right places, and aligned with how people actually work under pressure. Another core document set is the incident classification and severity model, because classification is how the organization decides what gets escalated, what gets resourced, and what gets communicated. A model should define what counts as an incident versus a lower-level event, and it should define severity levels based on impact and urgency, not based on how scary the technical details sound. Severity definitions should connect to outcomes such as sensitive data exposure, integrity impact to critical records, availability disruption of critical services, and potential safety or legal consequences. The model should also include confidence handling, because early in an investigation the team often has high uncertainty, and the organization needs a consistent way to act proportionately under uncertainty. In cloud and third-party contexts, classification should also account for shared responsibility and dependency effects, because a vendor outage or a cloud provider issue can create severe business impact even when malicious activity is not confirmed. Beginners sometimes think severity is a subjective label chosen by whoever is loudest, but a documented model reduces that subjectivity and prevents repeated re-arguing of the same severity decisions during every event. When severity is consistent, response becomes faster because escalation paths are predictable. Roles and responsibilities documentation is another foundation, because incident response requires coordinated action across people who often do not work together day to day. The documentation should clarify who leads the incident, who owns technical investigation, who owns containment decisions, who communicates with leadership, and who coordinates with legal, privacy, and communications functions when needed. It should also define backup roles, because incidents do not wait for ideal staffing, and response should not depend on a single person being available. In many organizations, the Security Operations Center, SOC, acts as the front door for detection and triage, while other teams perform deeper containment and recovery work, and that handoff must be documented or it will become a source of delay and conflict. Authority should be explicit, because teams lose time when they are uncertain whether they can disable an account, isolate a service, or restrict access during an active event. Beginners should understand that authority in incident response is not about power. It is about making sure protective actions happen quickly and responsibly. When roles are documented clearly, the response team spends its energy solving the problem rather than negotiating responsibility. Communication documentation is vital because incidents are as much about coordinated understanding as they are about technical containment. A documented communication plan should define who must be notified at each severity level, what information should be included in early updates, and how to avoid speculation while still providing useful situational awareness. It should also define how updates are scheduled, because constant, chaotic messaging can waste time and create contradictory narratives, while silence can cause leaders to fill gaps with assumptions. In cloud-centric incidents, communication must also include how to coordinate with cloud providers, managed service partners, and critical vendors, because external dependencies can shape both investigation and recovery. The communication plan should define who speaks externally if external communication becomes necessary, because uncontrolled messaging can create reputational and legal harm independent of the technical incident. Beginners often underestimate communication because it feels non-technical, but communication quality often determines whether an organization responds with calm focus or with confusion and blame. Documentation gives communication a structure that protects the team and the organization during the most stressful moments. Evidence handling and documentation discipline are also essential parts of an incident program, because incidents create questions that must be answered later, sometimes with high stakes. Evidence handling documentation should describe how to preserve relevant information, how to avoid contaminating evidence through careless actions, and how to maintain a record of decisions and actions taken during the event. This matters in cloud environments because evidence can be distributed across services, logs can have retention limits, and actions taken for containment can alter system state quickly. A disciplined approach includes documenting what was observed, what was collected, and what actions were taken, along with time context, so investigators can reconstruct an accurate timeline. It also includes guidance on what to prioritize when time is short, because you cannot collect everything, and collecting the wrong things can waste the crucial early window. Beginners should see evidence handling as a kind of self-control for the response team, because it prevents the team from destroying the very facts it needs to understand what happened. When evidence handling is documented, response becomes more consistent and defensible. Case management documentation turns incident work into a manageable process rather than a scattered set of conversations. A case record is where the team captures the narrative of the incident, including initial detection signals, the evolving hypothesis, the scope of affected assets, the actions taken, and the current assessment of impact and confidence. Documentation should define what a case must include so that cases remain consistent across analysts and across shifts, which supports handoffs and later learning. It should also define how cases are linked to related events, such as recurring alerts or previous incidents, because repeated patterns often reveal systemic gaps in controls. In cloud environments, case records are especially important because incidents can span multiple services and accounts, and it is easy to lose track of which actions were taken where. A strong case discipline also helps prevent duplicated effort, because team members can see what has already been checked and what remains uncertain. Beginners should understand that case management is not bureaucracy. It is the structure that keeps response momentum when the incident stretches across hours or days. When the case record is strong, the organization retains memory even when individuals are tired. Playbooks are a crucial part of program documentation because they translate broad plans into repeatable action for common scenarios. A playbook is not a rigid script that replaces thinking, but it is a structured guide that helps analysts and responders ask the right questions in the right order, especially when stress makes people skip steps. Playbooks should exist for the scenarios your organization is most likely to face, such as credential misuse, suspicious privilege escalation, data exposure concerns, malware behavior, and availability disruption affecting critical services. In cloud settings, playbooks should also address scenarios like compromised access keys, misconfigured access policies, and incidents involving shared responsibility with providers or partners. Each playbook should include decision points that help the team determine when to escalate, when to contain, and how to balance service continuity against investigative needs. Beginners should notice that the power of playbooks is that they reduce variance, meaning different people can respond similarly to similar situations, which makes outcomes more predictable. When playbooks are aligned with roles and communication plans, response becomes not only faster but more coordinated. Escalation criteria and decision authority documentation are another key layer because incidents often require fast decisions that carry operational risk. The documentation should clarify which actions can be taken immediately by responders, which actions require approval, and how to reach approvers quickly at any hour. This includes decisions like disabling accounts, restricting access to services, isolating resources, and initiating broader recovery actions that may affect customers or internal operations. In cloud environments, containment actions can be powerful and wide-reaching, so the documentation must define guardrails that prevent accidental disruption while still enabling rapid protection when impact is imminent. Escalation criteria should connect to severity definitions so the team does not hesitate when thresholds are crossed. It should also connect to risk tolerance, because some organizations choose to accept short service disruption to prevent larger harm, while others prioritize continuity and accept higher residual risk. Beginners should understand that without documented authority, responders may wait too long, and waiting too long can turn a manageable event into a crisis. Clear escalation documentation protects both speed and responsibility. Training and exercise documentation keeps the incident program real, because a plan that is never practiced becomes a plan people cannot follow under stress. Documentation should define how often the organization practices response, what kinds of scenarios are included, and how lessons learned are captured and turned into improvements. Exercises do not have to be dramatic, but they should test the parts of the program that often fail in real incidents, such as communication flow, handoffs, decision authority, and evidence discipline. In cloud-heavy environments, exercises should also include dependency coordination, such as how to work with providers and vendors, because those relationships can determine recovery speed and investigation clarity. Training documentation should also cover onboarding for new team members, because response quality degrades when newcomers do not understand the playbooks, the severity model, or the communication expectations. Beginners should see training as part of documentation because training brings documents to life and also reveals where documents are unclear or unrealistic. When exercises are documented and repeated, response becomes a practiced capability rather than a theoretical aspiration. Integration documentation is another essential piece because incident response is not a standalone island. It must connect to change management, vulnerability management, business continuity planning, and vendor management. When an incident reveals a control gap, the program needs a documented path for turning that gap into a tracked remediation effort with ownership and timelines. When an incident appears connected to a recent change, the program needs a documented way to pull change history and involve the right change owners quickly. When a vendor is involved, the program needs documented contact paths, escalation routes, and expectations about cooperation and evidence sharing. In cloud environments, integration is especially important because services are interconnected and changes can be frequent, which means incidents can be tightly linked to deployments and configuration adjustments. Beginners often assume incident response begins when an alert fires, but a mature program also begins before incidents by ensuring all these connected processes are aligned and ready. Documentation is the glue that makes these integrations reliable rather than ad hoc. When integration is clear, the organization can move from incident to improvement without losing momentum. Metrics and reporting documentation helps decision-makers understand whether the incident response program is healthy and improving, and it also helps the team avoid measuring the wrong things. Metrics should reflect outcomes that matter, such as time to detect, time to triage, time to contain, and the quality of post-incident learning and remediation follow-through. It is tempting to measure raw incident counts, but raw counts can rise as detection improves. So counts alone can mislead leaders into thinking the program is getting worse when it is actually getting more honest. Reporting documentation should define how incidents are summarized for leadership, what information is included without speculation, and how trends are communicated in ways that lead to decisions. In cloud environments, reporting should also track dependency-driven incidents and visibility gaps, because those are common drivers of impact and confusion. Beginners should learn that metrics are part of documentation because documentation defines what success looks like, and metrics are how you test whether the program is achieving that success. When reporting is consistent, leaders can support improvements with better confidence. Post-incident review documentation is the part of the program that ensures the organization actually learns, because without learning, the same mistakes repeat with different names. A review process should define when reviews happen, who attends, what questions are asked, and how corrective actions are tracked to completion. The focus should be on understanding root causes, including technical, procedural, and communication causes, rather than focusing only on the final trigger event. Reviews should also capture what worked well, because reinforcing effective behavior is as important as fixing failures, especially in high-stress response work. In cloud environments, reviews should examine shared responsibility boundaries and whether assumptions about provider behavior and logging availability were correct, because those assumptions often shape response effectiveness. Beginners sometimes assume a review is a meeting to assign blame, but a mature review is a structured learning exercise that strengthens the program and improves confidence. When reviews consistently drive remediation, the organization becomes less reactive over time. Finally, maintaining incident program documentation is itself a governance task, because stale documentation is almost worse than no documentation, since it creates false confidence. Documentation must have owners, review intervals, and an update process that ensures changes in systems, teams, and vendor relationships are reflected before an incident forces discovery of outdated information. Maintenance also includes communicating updates and retraining when needed, because a playbook no one knows has changed is not a real control. In cloud environments, where services evolve and configuration models shift, maintenance must be steady and disciplined so response procedures remain aligned with reality. Beginners should understand that documentation is not a one-time deliverable, but a living backbone, and living backbones require care. When documentation maintenance is treated as part of operations, the incident response program remains coherent across years, not just across one incident. That coherence is what makes response consistent, and consistency is what reduces both impact and organizational stress during crises. To conclude, incident program documentation is what turns a response capability into a repeatable, defensible, and coordinated organizational practice that can be trusted when the stakes are high. A mature incident response (IR) program uses documentation to define scope, severity, roles, authority, communication, evidence handling, case management, and playbooks so that decisions and actions remain consistent under pressure. It also documents training and exercises, integrations with related operational processes, metrics and reporting, and post-incident reviews that drive real improvement rather than repeated pain. In cloud-centric environments, this documentation is even more valuable because change and dependency are constant, and the program must be able to operate reliably across shifting services and shared responsibility boundaries. The core beginner takeaway is that consistent response is not a personality trait and not a lucky outcome. It is the product of clear, maintained documentation that guides people toward the same good decisions again and again. When the documentation is treated as living infrastructure, the organization responds faster, communicates more clearly, preserves evidence more reliably, and learns more effectively after every event. That is how an incident program becomes something leaders can depend on and teams can execute with confidence.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.